Okay, so the 2021 contract changes for FARBAR, what the realtor needs to know. Let's start off with a disclaimer. I'm an attorney, so we have to start with a disclaimer. We'll be giving you a lot of information today, but none of it constitutes legal advice. If you have any specific questions, you can always contact me afterwards and we can go over your specific situation. Just a little bit about my law firm. We were founded in 2007. We focus on real estate and business law, and we are dedicated to helping small business owners, entrepreneurs, buyers, sellers, property managers. And I want to point out one thing here. Small business owners includes realtors. You guys own your own business, you're independent contractors. I'm happy to help you with all of your other issues related to your business practices. We also have a full service litigation department, and we have offices throughout Southwest Florida. A little bit about me. I've been doing this since 2003. I'm a member of the NABOR Legal Resources Committee and the Residential Real Estate Industry Liaison Committee for the Florida Bar. That means I help work on this FARBAR contract when they make their changes. I am a recovering politician, so please excuse my jokes. Let's dive right into the contract. So the FARBAR contract was updated at the end of last year with some pretty hefty changes in terms of how they do it. They're supposed to make changes every few years, but this took quite a while to get done. And right off the bat, in paragraph 1 of the new contract, they made some changes to the description of what conveys. They're trying to capture the smart home features. They added mailboxes and keys, and they clarified that the storm protection items and hardware all transfers. But notice here, the Ring doorbells, the television wall mounts, the television mounting hardware, all of those things, they clarify that all of that stays on the property. Notice what's not listed in here is televisions. So remember the old rule, if it's screwed or glued, it stays. So if a television is hung on the television mounting bracket, then the television can be removed, but the bracket stays. That's always a question that people have. Does the TV stay? The TV does not have to stay, but the brackets do. A little confusing, but that's the way it is. Also, don't forget that in the FARBAR contract, for those of you in Collier County that use the NABOR contract, the washer and dryer is still not included. So if you intend to convey the washer and dryer, you have to write it in the blank here. Okay, moving right along. Paragraph 2, they cleaned up the purchase price, unbolded a few things, and refer you to standard S for, says that checks have to clear the bank, which basically means no checks for closing. You've got to use a wired funds because we can't wait for a check to clear. It will delay closing. And that would be bad for the buyer because they could lose their deposit. And then they made little changes in here, as you can see on the slide, to the escrow agent fill-in information. So this is a pretty decent change. This paragraph 4, the closing and the closing date were changed. It says when all funds required for closing are received by the closing agent and collected, in caps, pursuant to standard S. So they redefined what the closing is, and they clarified that it can be modified by other provisions. The closing date can be modified by other provisions of the contract, which we are going to go over. And note that the closing may be delayed if the funds are not collected, and it could put the buyer in breach of contract. Let's be very careful there to make sure that we don't miss the closing date by having our funds not available. As you know, in the FARBAR contract, time is of the essence for each and every deadline. In the NABOR contract, time is of the essence.
I'm watching a Sam thing.
Hi, Tina.
When you were in school.
Sorry about that. A Sam thing, that's great. So be very careful about making sure that you don't miss the closing date in either contract, but particularly don't miss any of the other dates in the FARBAR contract. So when can the closing date be extended? Well, the closing date can be extended if the CFPB compliance requirements are not met in time, but note that it's been changed from 10 days to 7 days. I'm highlighting here. Very important, 3 less days to get your CFPB compliance done. The rationale for this change is that it only takes 3 days really to do the CD signing electronically. So we shouldn't need 10 extra days to get the closing done after the CFPB rule has been complied with. Note there are 3 requirements to get this CFPB extension. There must be a financing provision, 8B must be checked. Loan approval must have been obtained. And we'll talk more about the definition of loan approval when we get to the financing section. And then the underwriting must be complete. So you'll be very careful to make sure that all 3 of these requirements are met before your 7 days kicks in. So a lot of people get confused about this, and this is to clarify that the loan approval has to be obtained and underwriting has to be complete, or you don't get 7 days. You have to be on the closing date. This can cause a lot of problems for people who are not applying for loans on time, or who apply for loans and they don't give enough time in the contract itself to get the loan done. And you really got to stay on top of your lenders now. Okay, this is a little bit of a cleanup here in paragraph 6, occupancy and possession. They cleaned up 6A to just say that they took some of this language out and they put in the pre-closing occupancy as a contingency here. Not a lot of changes, but they did say that any occupancy agreement. So when you check the box for 6B, if the property is subject to a lease, it could be subject to an occupancy agreement as opposed to a simple lease. So that's a little bit of a change there. And then of course you don't need estoppel letters from the tenants for seasonal rentals. That was always a question, and now it's clarified in the contract. So for those of you that deal with the VRBOs, the Airbnbs, you know how difficult it is to transfer those or to even get a hold of any tenant in that situation. You can now rest assured that we do not have to chase down the tenants and have them sign estoppel letters. So note here, in paragraph 7, they used to not have a default. There is now a default that the buyer may not assign the contract if nothing is checked in paragraph 7. This is something of an important change for those of you that work with any investors or people who might want to transfer the property to a trust, because the Florida common law default is that a contract is freely assignable. So in the FAR contract, they changed that default to say that it is not assignable unless you have checked one of the assignment boxes. And typically people will check this second box that allow for assignment without release of liability. So be very careful if you miss this box, which many folks do, that you understand the contract is not assignable. And if the buyer wants to transfer the ownership to an LLC, they may have to do it after closing if the seller will not agree. Okay, any questions on any of that before I dive into financing? Okay, all pretty simple stuff so far. So let's talk about the financing. So FAR financing is complicated. Let's start with that. So I want to start off with some definitions. The loan approval period, the financing, the appraisal, and the loan approval definitions are very, very important in this contract. The loan approval period is the time the buyer has to obtain loan approval. It's 30 days by default. You can extend this for longer, although in this market, usually people are shortening it and they're having a tough time getting their lenders to comply with the short time periods. Just know that once you've got the loan approval period in there, you got to get your loan done in that time, or you're going to be negotiating an extension of the loan approval period, and that may not be forthcoming from a seller in this market. Financing are the terms upon which the buyer seeks to borrow money, including the loan type, interest rate, and terms of the loan. The appraisal is an appraisal we think of, or an alternate valuation. It's the value of the property is determined by an independent third party and has to be satisfactory to the lender. That's going to be important as we talk, because appraisal, this contract is no longer subject to an appraisal. And that's going to be very, very important when we get into that next few slides. And then of course, loan approval is a loan that meets the financing and appraisal terms of the contract laid out in the contract. That's your interest rate, your borrowing period, your amortization period, all those things. So let's start off by looking at the contract language. Notice here, number one, under cash financing, this says that there is no financing contingency. This is a cash transaction with no financing contingency. They took out all this other language about may obtain a loan or all that sort of thing. One thing to think about though is people say, well, I understand it's a cash transaction, but interest rates, at least until the last few weeks, have been so good that I want to get financing anyways. You can get financing with a cash transaction. That's allowed. It's not a violation or breach of the contract. It just means that if you don't show up with the cash from the lender on the closing date, you lose your deposit. The other thing to think about in this is, well, if I'm going to get a loan, how do I get the appraisal in there, the appraiser in there to get my appraisal done or anything else, or my 4-point inspection for the insurance? Well, standard L of this contract isn't changing, and it says that access is granted for inspections, appraisals, et cetera, et cetera. So you still can get a loan with a cash transaction. Just be aware you won't have any protections other than access should the loan fall through, and you better have the cash ready to go. So talk about getting financing. Notice here all the green, lots of changes. This contract is contingent upon 30 days loan approval period. The buyer obtaining a loan of this type, conventional, FHA, VA, or other, and for the purchase of the property at a fixed rate, adjustable rate in the loan amount, see paragraph 2C, that's on page 1 of your contract, at an initial rate of interest not to exceed, and you put your amount in here. And it's for 30 years unless you pick a shorter time frame if you get like a 15-year loan. And see here I highlighted and circled, and the lender receives an appraisal. So this is a major revision. The appraisal has to be ordered early now. You cannot wait until after inspections. You can't wait until the buyer's ready to pay the appraiser. You got to do it right away at the beginning. So don't, when you've got your buyer and you're talking to them before they even make their contract, if they're going to be financing, they need to know up front they're going to pay for an appraisal very quickly, and they need to be prepared to do that. It has to be completed in the loan approval period, which is 30 days by default. So be very cautious there as you go through and get your buyer ready. I don't want people to say, well, I didn't get my appraisal in time, I got to terminate, because then you waste the money on the appraisal. The rest of this, the buyer shall make loan application for financing within 5 days if they don't change this. So 5 days, it's very quick. You got to get your application into your lender. You have to use good faith and diligent effort to obtain approval of the loan, meeting the financing and appraisal terms. That's your loan approval. And within the loan approval period, and then you have to close on the contract. So the other thing here is the loan approval, which requires the buyer to sell other property. So the buyer's got to sell some property before they can purchase this property. Make sure you attach Rider V, the new Rider V, to the contract. We don't want to miss that and then not have a contingency for the sale of our property if we need that. And they added this good faith and diligent effort to obtain loan approval. That means defined here that you've got to pay for the appraisal and other fees and charges, and you've got to be getting your documents to your lender as quickly as possible. So it's not just make applications, also fill everything out, get your tax returns in, get your W-2s in, whatever else you need to get your loan approved. You've got to do it with good faith and diligent effort. So basically, you cannot screw around with the loan approval process. You've got to get moving. Also, the seller may request updates directly from the lender in writing, and the buyer must notify when they receive loan approval. So this clarifies that buyer shall notify seller of same in writing prior to expiration of the loan approval period, or if they're unable to obtain loan approval, but buyer is satisfied with their ability to obtain the loan, then you would waive the financing contingency and you proceed to closing. So you've got to be very cautious, again, to make sure that everything is going at pace, but with the lender, so that when you go to waive the finance contingency, you either have the loan or you feel satisfied that you will get the loan. If you don't think you're going to get the loan, then you have to terminate in the contingency period. If you're unable to obtain loan approval within the loan approval period or cannot timely meet the terms of loan approval after the exercise of good faith and diligent effort, then the buyer may terminate the contract. See, your buyer is all in the green. Buyer may terminate this contract. So again, pretend it's 30 days. It could be longer or shorter, depending on what you put in the blank. But you got 30 days to get your loan approved, get your appraisal done. If you don't, and you've exercised good faith and diligent effort, then you can terminate within the loan approval period. Okay, by delivering written notice of termination to the seller prior to expiration of the loan approval period. That's 11/59 on the day the loan approval period expires. You must deliver the termination to the seller. And then if you're not in default, then you get your deposit back. If the buyer fails to timely deliver written notice to the seller prior to the approval period, then the buyer has to proceed forward with the contract, but the seller gets 3 days to terminate and give the deposit back. Why is this important? If you have a seller and they are concerned that the buyer is not going to be able to close with cash, or that the loan is not going to be done on time, there's a very short 3-day window for the buyer to terminate and give the deposit back, and of course, put it back on the market as quickly as possible. I have a question in the chat. Linda, yes, I will provide the slides after this class. Continuing with the financing contingency. Oops. The buyer gets their deposit back. We said that. Then if the loan has been timely provided, either if the buyer has provided timely notice and fails to close, the deposit goes to the seller. So there is no going back. I think that's very important. Once you've waived the finance contingency by saying you have loan approval, you're stuck and the buyer is going to close it. And note here, this is where the appraisal contingency was removed, right here. And note that verification of employment income is not a properly related condition, so you've got to get all that done as well during the loan approval period. Okay, questions about financing? Let's see here. Breeze, yes, we will have a copy of the recording provided afterwards. Jackie, the 1031 language is in the contract. You do not need to check the box for assignability for a 1031. Other questions so far? Financing questions? You can unmute yourself. I know it's complicated. I know it gets sticky pretty fast. Okay, seeing none, let's move along. Paragraph 9A adds charges for FERPTA withholding and reporting to the seller as a seller's expense. So paragraph 9A, of course, is the closing costs. And now it's just very clear that FERPTA withholding and reporting is a seller expense. People are confused about that. Don't forget, FERPTA is a buyer responsibility, but a seller expense. So that can get a little confusing if you are not aware. The buyer has to withhold the 15%, but the seller's got to pay for the accountant to do the paperwork. 9C clarifies that the seller is furnishing a copy of the prior policy and that the buyer in Miami-Dade picks the closing agent. Very simple changes here. Paragraph 9D, at least 5 days prior to closing. This is a fairly significant date change event. The buyer could provide a survey, and that could extend closing for up to 30 additional days while the cure period is used to remedy survey defects. So that's a major date change, especially for sellers in vacant lots. If you're in Cape Coral or Lehigh and you've got encroachments, and you get the survey 5 days prior to closing, you may realize that you got 30 days. So for sellers who are counting on that money, you've got to be very careful about how you time these. Paragraph 9F clarifies that the seller pays the special assessments when the public body allows it. If no box is checked, if you don't check A or B, then the charges are split. And note that this does not apply to special taxing districts or CDDs. They have their own, they get prorated. They're on the tax bill, so they get prorated. But you can see here that they added this language: sellers shall pay in full prior to or at the time of closing any assessments allowed by the public body to be prepaid. If they do not allow prepaid, then option A is deemed selected, and we do the installments. So that just clarifies that. In 12B2, property conditions, so they say that the watercrafts, lifts, and the related equipment may be inspected and shall be maintained in working order. This is an addition. There was some confusion about whether lifts and related equipment for boats on the water had to be maintained. They do, and now it's abundantly clear. I thought this was kind of a silly change. I always thought it was required, but somebody questioned it, and now it is. So this is another great change for sellers. The seller used to have to go get estimates before they made any changes to the property. They no longer have to do that. They can just make the changes. If you give a repair list under the FAR contract to the seller and it's less than the amount agreed to, the 1.5% for repairs in the FAR standard contract, then the seller can just go ahead and make the repairs. They don't need to go and get all the estimates they used to have to do. It just says here, completed at seller's expense or have repairs estimated by an appropriately licensed person. So that's a fairly simple change that eases things for the seller. Note here, time is of the essence in this contract. They moved that to the front and clarified it. It's still bold because it's so important. They removed the 5 p.m. deadline. So now in the FAR contract, it matches the NABOR contract. All deadlines end at 11:59. And on the date stated in the contract, if it falls on a legal public holiday or Saturday or Sunday, it rolls till 11:59 the next business day. In the force majeure, of course, having gone through or still in, depending on your preference, a pandemic, they added that civil epidemics and pandemics are now part of the force majeure clause. Remember, the force majeure clause says that we pause performance during a force majeure event, hurricanes, floods, those sorts of things. where by the exercise of reasonable diligent effort, the non-performing party is unable in whole or in part to prevent or overcome. What does that mean? Just because we're in a pandemic, you cannot pause performance unless after reasonable and diligent effort, you are unable to perform. Now, of course, with Zoom and remote online notary and all the new technologies, being unable to perform during the pandemic has become less and less of a burden, making this paragraph less and less important. And note that they clarify here also that the force majeure event begins on the first day the effect of the force majeure prevents performance, non-performance, or the availability of services, insurances, or other required approvals essential for closing. So I know we're all probably all thinking about pandemics right now, but we are approaching hurricane season. And if you think about it, when the hurricane comes through, it may not be the day the hurricane hits that the force majeure started if everybody shuts down 2 days before because they got to go board up their houses. So maybe there's going to be arguments over when the force majeure started. I will say, though, that at least in Southwest Florida, the force majeure issues in the Hurricane Irma were very slight because everybody worked together. So hopefully in the future that will continue along. Okay, for those of you on the East Coast, we have they have updated the geographic targeting order language, and it requires the buyer to comply with the FinCEN orders, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network order, that basically says buyers cannot be anonymous. That's all that really says. Buyers cannot be anonymous anymore. Oh, by the way, on this one, for those of you in Southwest Florida, this only applies to the East Coast. It's Broward, Palm Beach, and Dade counties. Okay, so this is a big change, major important change for all realtors who love text messaging. Any realtor not love to text? I don't see any hands going up. That's because everyone uses text messages. Well, in the contract, you cannot, I repeat, you cannot text. You can't accept the contract. You can negotiate inspections through text messaging anymore. They took that out. It was becoming too much of a problem to prove who said what, when, and where through text message. So they say all notices must be in writing and may only, notice this, only be by mail, facsimile, transmission, personal delivery, or email. Kat is very happy. No more texting, because texting is too fleeting. They're deleted. They're not maintained properly. There's not a good record. So it also clarifies that the contract cannot be recorded in the clerk of court's office. Any questions about text messages? Good. Okay, so standard S, I mentioned this at the beginning when I was talking about deposits. Yes, people are very excited about text messages, yes. Talking about deposits, you have to have collected funds. That means that any checks that are tendered or received must be actually and finally collected and deposited in the escrow account prior to the closing, or you're going to have a problem. We have a question. I hear something. Make sure you stay on mute unless you have a question. Okay, let's talk about the addenda. There is a mold inspection addendum now. So we're talking about that. And then there's the seasonal rentals, the PACE disclosures, and then they made a few changes to some of the other ones. So the HOA clarified, the new HOA Rider B clarifies the seller pays association assessments due prior to the closing date. NABORD's prior to the effective date. So for those of you that practice in both places, know your differences. and that the seller has to pay all association fines and estoppel fees. That was not clear in this contract before. If the seller has a fine due to the association, they have to pay it at or prior to closing, and we would collect at closing for that. New rider for the FHA VA, I did not put the actual language up here. It's very small. It just clarifies that the seller complies with the lender requirements and the appraisal will pair up to the stated limits. And the seller has to pay the VA fee up to $250. Okay, this is a new inspection for mold. This is new to FAR/BAR world. If you use the NABOR contracts, you're used to mold inspections. If you're used to the FAR/BAR contracts, you are not used to mold inspections, but you will be soon. And it says that you have to have a licensed inspector. There's 20 days to get the test done, and the buyer can terminate if the remedial action for the mold exceeds the amount stated in the blank here that's highlighted. Very simple. Rider T clarifies the party can enter into a lease, pre-closing occupancy agreement, or other similar agreement. You no longer need a lease. FAR/BAR used to require pre-closing and post-closing leases. Same change to the post-closing occupancy. It's just does not have to be a lease. Okay. Rider V, we talked about this. The buyer's property must close on the date stated in this contract. This is the contingency for the sale of buyer's property used when they've got to sell before they buy. The buyer has to give a copy of the contract for a sale, or there's no contingency, and you have 24 hours from the effective date of the buyer's new contract if it's not done prior to the entry into the contract that you're working on. I will say this about this rider, it's not very well written. There's some confusion down here about the buyer's property is presently under contract. If buyer's property is under contract at the time this offer is made, buyer shall provide seller with a copy with information obliterated simultaneously with the original signed contract submitted to seller. See, this does not make sense. They have this comma here, and that should be probably a separate sentence. So be very careful using rider V if you've got a contingency for the sale of the buyer's property. I would probably rewrite that for you if you gave me a call. New rider DD for seasonal rentals. It allows or prevents the seller from entering into additional leases, and it subjects the buyer to the seller's property management agreement. After the buyer has had an opportunity to review it, they have 5 days to either accept the property management agreement or terminate the contract. And not the property management contract, the sales contract. And this is probably going to be more and more used, because when you've got a seller and they're actively doing VRBOs, you're going to want to make sure that the buyer has the opportunity to examine all those leases and understand what they're getting into for post-closing. So I assume that everybody has heard of PACE loans. If you've not heard of a PACE loan, briefly, PACE is the Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, and it provides special financing for property owners based on the tax bill, as opposed to having to go borrow based on your ability to pay. So it becomes a super lien. This is a very, from a titling perspective, a very dangerous loan, because it's got to be cleared at closing. So we pay these off at closing, and getting the information can be very daunting for the title company. The problem you run into is these loans can take 18 months to show up on the tax bill. And so we may not know it's out there until after closing. So if you know that a PACE loan is involved, then please make sure to use this PACE loan rider EE. And with that, I got through those much faster than I planned on. Does anybody have any questions? Anyone, you can unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Questions about the FAR bar contract? Nobody has any? All right, then everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to the FAR bar contract changes class today. I appreciate your attendance. And you can always call me or email me offline. I will tell you this, I'm going to be emailing the presentation and the slides out in a little while. So if you have anything later, just give me a shout. Oh, somebody have a question?
Yeah, Sam, a question
Yes, Dan.
regarding the survey on an improved property.
Yeah.
If the survey is over a year old and nothing has changed on that property, is that survey acceptable? Or does it have to be something within a certain time limit?
There's not a time limit. What I like to see on a prior survey, Dan, is that it's certified to the person who's going to be signing the affidavit saying there's no changes.
Okay.
So if you've got a survey that's like 2 owners old, I wouldn't accept that probably. I would probably want a new survey. But if the seller is the one that got the previous survey and they're willing to sign the affidavit of no change, then I think you're fine, even if it's 5 or 6 or 10 years old.
All right. Is there a disclosure for that?
I believe it's in the contract. It says, yeah, it says in here, my line numbers would be off, but if the seller has delivered a prior survey, then at buyer's request, there can be a no change affidavit signed.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks, Sam.
Yep. Yola is asking when 5 p.m. was removed, where in the contracts it mentioned about 11:59. Yola, if you go back to, where did I say that? Time. It is in standard F, Yola. So if you look in standard F, you can see here that the 5 p.m. was scratched out right here. And it says next calendar day. Other questions? Anybody? Going once? Going twice?
I have a question. Is
Yes, Valentina.
this the same as is contract also?
Say it again.
Is the changes is in as is contract also for the
Yes,
standard?
yes, Valentina, it's a
for
very
this
good question. Yes, the as-is contract, except for the parts about inspections, all these changes were made to both the as-is and the regular FAR bar contract. That's an excellent question. Thank you for reminding me to say that. So the as-is contract was also updated. And the as-is contract, of course, is the #1 contract in Florida. So knowing these changes is very, very important for that contract as well. Okay. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. All right, everybody, thank you so much for your time today. I will be available for questions at any time. Talk to you soon.